The farmhouse stood alone, surrounded by dense woods and a chilling silence that seemed to cling to the air. It was a place untouched by time, its weathered walls whispering secrets of the past. The young family who moved in believed they had found their dream home, a quiet escape from the noise of the city. The father, a hardworking man, saw it as a chance to reconnect with nature and provide a peaceful life for his wife and two children. The mother, a gentle soul, was drawn to the house's old-world charm, envisioning warm, cozy evenings by the fireplace. But as they settled in, the farmhouse began to reveal its true nature. The first night brought an unsettling stillness, a silence so thick it pressed against their eardrums. The wind howled through the trees outside, but inside there was a heavy quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The children, once excited about their new rooms, soon complained of cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. The mother felt an odd unease, a sense that they were not alone, but she pushed it aside, attributing it to the stress of the move. As days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences started. It began with small things: the faint sound of footsteps when no one was walking, doors that creaked open on their own, and shadows that seemed to move just beyond the corner of one's eye. The family dismissed these as quirks of an old house, until the night the mother woke up, heart pounding, to the sight of a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stared with hollow, empty eyes. When she finally found her voice, the figure vanished, leaving only the cold, suffocating dread that lingered long after the morning light chased away the darkness. The children began to act strangely, speaking of new friends who visited them at night, friends with pale faces and sad eyes. The father, ever the skeptic, laughed it off as childish imagination, but the mother knew something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. She could feel it in the very bones of the house, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, in the way the air grew colder with each passing day. The farmhouse was not just old, it was cursed, haunted by a past filled with darkness and despair. The final straw came when the mother discovered the house's history, a tale of witchcraft, madness, and a family that vanished without a trace. The farmhouse, it seemed, had a hunger, a need for souls to torment, to feed the malevolent force that dwelled within its walls. And now it had found new prey in this unsuspecting family. The realization hit her like a physical blow, the dread rising in her throat as she understood that they were trapped, caught in a web of evil that would not let them go so easily. The uneasy feeling in the house grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just the cold drafts or the strange noises anymore. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing in sync with the fear that slowly crept into the family's hearts. The mother tried to stay calm for the sake of her children, but the dread gnawed at her constantly. Every night the farmhouse seemed to shift, the creaks in the floorboards more pronounced, the shadows darker, and the silence heavier. It started with the children. They became quieter, their laughter fading into whispers and nervous glances. They spoke less about their imaginary friends, but when they did, it was with a fear that made the mother's blood run cold. The youngest child, a sweet girl with big, innocent eyes, began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming as if something was attacking her. When her parents rushed into her room, they found her huddled in a corner, shaking uncontrollably, her eyes wide with terror. She would only mutter about the man in the dark, who watched her while she slept. The father, still in denial, tried to find logical explanations for everything. He checked the windows for drafts, inspected the floors for loose boards, and even called in an electrician to explain the flickering lights. But nothing seemed to fix the disturbances. Objects continued to move on their own. Picture frames tilted, chairs shifted, and once, the kitchen knives were found stuck into the wooden table as if someone had thrown them with force. The father's skepticism began to waver, but he refused to show fear, not wanting to alarm his family any further. The mother's nightmares intensified, each more vivid and terrifying than the last. In her dreams, she saw the farmhouse as it once was, filled with people whose faces were twisted in fear and agony. They reached out to her, their mouths open in silent screams, begging for help she couldn't give. The dark figure, always present, grew closer in each dream, its hollow eyes boring into her soul, as if claiming her as its next victim. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, only to find herself unable to move, paralyzed by an unseen force holding her down. The family's dog, usually a loyal and protective companion, began behaving strangely too. It would growl at empty corners, its fur bristling, and sometimes it would bark furiously at the front door as if something or someone was standing just outside. One evening, after another episode of barking and growling, the dog vanished. The family searched the property, calling its name, but it was as if the dog had simply disappeared into thin air. That night, the house felt even more oppressive, the air thick with a malevolent presence that made it hard to breathe. The mother, now convinced that something evil lurked in their home, decided to investigate further. She spent hours at the local library, digging through old records and newspapers. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The farmhouse had a dark history, one filled with tales of witchcraft, rituals, and the unexplained disappearances of those who dared to live there. It was said that the original owner, a woman accused of being a witch, had cursed the land before she was hanged. Her dying words promised that the house would never be free from the evil she had summoned, and that all who lived there would suffer. Armed with this knowledge, the mother tried to convince her husband that they needed to leave, but he wouldn't hear of it. They had invested everything into this house, and he refused to abandon it because of some old ghost stories. But deep down, the mother knew it wasn't just stories. They were living in a nightmare that was only getting worse. The house had them in its grip, and it wasn't going to let go. As the days turned into weeks, the farmhouse's grip on the family tightened. The once subtle disturbances grew more aggressive, and the atmosphere in the house became suffocating. Every corner of the home seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, a malevolence that could no longer be ignored. The walls creaked as though they were alive, and the floors groaned under the weight of something far more sinister than the family could comprehend. The children were the first to feel the brunt of the escalating horror. They became increasingly withdrawn, their faces pale, and their eyes haunted by something they couldn't fully articulate. The youngest began drawing disturbing images, dark figures looming over the farmhouse, shadowy creatures with gaping mouths, and eyes that watched from every corner. She stopped sleeping in her room, refusing to go near it after sunset, claiming that they wouldn't let her sleep. One night, the father was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. He rushed downstairs to find the living room mirror shattered into pieces, yet there was no one in sight. As he bent down to pick up the shards, he noticed something chilling. The fragments of glass reflected not his own face, but that of a woman, her expression twisted in rage. He blinked, and the reflection was gone, leaving him shaken and questioning his sanity. The mother's nightmares had now bled into her waking life. She started seeing things, ghostly apparitions of long-dead former residents, their faces etched with suffering, wandering the halls of the farmhouse. They were not just glimpses anymore. They would stand in her way, blocking her path, reaching out as if to drag her into their eternal torment. The dark figure from her dreams became a constant presence, always lurking just beyond the light, a harbinger of the horrors that were yet to come. The father, who had been the last to admit that something was wrong, could no longer deny the truth. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, he heard a faint whispering coming from the walls. It was not just random noise, but distinct voices, chanting in a language he did not understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening, filling his head with a cacophony of sinister words. Suddenly, the furniture around him began to move on its own. Chairs scraped across the floor, books flew off the shelves, and the heavy wooden table slid violently toward him, knocking him to the ground. Terrified and desperate, the family reached out for help. They contacted a local priest, a man known for his work in exorcisms and blessings. When the priest arrived, the house seemed to come alive, reacting violently to his presence. As he sprinkled holy water and recited prayers, the walls shook and a deep guttural growl echoed through the house, a sound so unnatural it froze everyone in place. The priest was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he tried to continue. But the entity within the house was too powerful. It mocked the priest's efforts, turning his blessing into a display of its own terrifying strength. The priest left, defeated and unable to help, warning the family that they were dealing with something far beyond the ordinary, a malevolent force that had claimed the house as its own. Desperate, the mother sought out a renowned paranormal investigator, someone with experience in dealing with the darkest of hauntings. The investigator arrived with a team, bringing with them equipment to measure and document the supernatural occurrences. As the investigator began his work, the true horror of the situation was revealed. The farmhouse, he explained, was a place where evil had been deliberately summoned and bound. The land was cursed, and the house was a vessel for a demonic entity that fed on fear, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. The investigator uncovered evidence of dark rituals performed by the original owner, a woman who had dabbled in forbidden practices, calling forth a force that could not be controlled. The investigator warned the family that they were in grave danger. The entity had become attached to them, and it would not stop until it had claimed every one of them. As the night wore on, the activity in the house escalated to levels never before seen. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows shattered, and the temperature dropped so drastically that their breath turned to mist. The dark figure, no longer content with staying in the shadows, began to show itself fully. A towering, grotesque form with eyes that burned with hatred, stalking the family, cornering them in their own home. The family was trapped. The walls of the farmhouse closing in around them. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was a force of nature, an unstoppable evil that had them in its sights. The investigator, realizing the severity of the situation, prepared for the final showdown, knowing that this battle would determine whether the family would survive or join the countless others who had vanished within the farmhouse's walls. The horror had only just begun, and the worst was yet to come. The air inside the farmhouse grew thicker, charged with a dark energy that made it difficult to breathe. The walls, once a simple structure of wood and plaster, now seemed to pulse with life, a malevolent force radiating from within. The investigator knew that they were dealing with something far beyond a typical haunting. This was no restless spirit, but a demon, a creature of pure evil, summoned from the depths of darkness and now fully awakened. The investigator gathered the family in the living room, the safest place he could find, though safety felt like a distant memory in this house. He explained the dire situation. The entity was not just haunting them, it was trying to possess them, to claim their souls as its own. It had been growing stronger with each act of fear and despair, feeding off their terror, and now it was nearly unstoppable. The only hope was to confront it head-on, to banish it back to the hell from which it came. Armed with holy relics, ancient texts, and rituals passed down through generations, the investigator prepared for the exorcism. The family watched in a tense silence, their fear palpable. The children clung to their mother, their eyes wide with terror, while the father stood by, his face pale and drawn, finally understanding the gravity of what they were facing. As the investigator began the ritual, reading from a worn, leather-bound book, the atmosphere in the room changed. The temperature dropped to freezing, and an unnatural darkness descended, so thick it seemed to swallow the light from the candles. The walls groaned, and a low guttural growl emanated from the very structure of the house, reverberating through the floorboards and into their bones. The entity was angry, its presence now fully manifested, and it was ready to fight back. The dark figure, no longer confined to the shadows, appeared in the center of the room, towering over them. Its form was barely human, a grotesque, twisted silhouette with burning red eyes and a mouth that stretched into an unnatural, sinister grin. The investigator's voice grew louder, more forceful, as he commanded the demon to leave, to return to the abyss. But the entity only laughed, a sound so cold and cruel it sent shivers down their spines. The house erupted into chaos. Furniture flew across the room, smashing into walls. Windows shattered inward. showering the family with glass, and the ground beneath them trembled as if the earth itself was tearing apart. The children screamed, the mother tried to shield them, and the father grabbed a piece of broken furniture, futilely attempting to defend his family against something that could not be fought with physical strength. The entity attacked, first targeting the investigator, sending him crashing into the wall with a force that knocked the breath out of him. He struggled to his feet, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead, and continued the ritual, refusing to give up. But the entity was too strong. It had fed on the fear and anguish of too many victims over the years, and now it was more powerful than ever. Realizing the exorcism was failing, the investigator made a desperate decision. He handed the mother a relic, an old iron cross that had been blessed by a priest long ago. "This will hold it back," he said, his voice strained, "but only for a moment. You must get your family out of here, now." The mother took the cross with trembling hands, knowing that their time was running out. As the investigator continued the ritual, sacrificing himself to buy them precious seconds, the mother grabbed her children and ran. The father, seeing the determination in her eyes, followed, though his legs felt like they were moving through molasses. They could hear the entity's rage behind them, the sound of the investigator's voice growing weaker as he battled the demon alone. They reached the front door, but it slammed shut before they could escape, the lock clicking into place. The mother frantically tried to open it, her hands slipping on the doorknob as the cross grew hotter in her grip. The entity was coming, and they could feel it. The air around them grew thicker, darker, as if it were pressing in on them, choking the life out of them. The investigator's voice suddenly stopped, cut off by a horrible, wet sound that echoed through the house. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, a void filled with dread. The mother knew what it meant. The entity had won, and now it was coming for them. With a final desperate push, the father threw his weight against the door, breaking it open. The family stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the cross falling from the mother's hand as they ran as fast as they could, away from the farmhouse that had nearly claimed their lives. But as they reached the edge of the property, they realized the horror wasn't over. The youngest child, lagging behind, suddenly stopped, her eyes wide with terror. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's here." The mother turned to see the dark figure standing behind her child, its burning eyes fixed on her with a look of triumph. Before she could react, the entity reached out and grabbed the child, pulling her back towards the house. The mother screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, sealing her daughter inside with the demon. The farmhouse stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But the mother knew the truth. Her child was gone, taken by the entity, a sacrifice to the evil that would continue to haunt the house for eternity. The remaining family members collapsed on the ground, their screams echoing into the night, their hearts shattered by the loss. The farmhouse, now quiet and dark, loomed in the distance, a reminder of the horror that still lurked within its walls. And somewhere inside, the demon smiled, knowing that its hunger had been sated for now, but that it would rise again when new prey arrived. The nightmare was far from over. The night was eerily quiet as the family stumbled away from the farmhouse, their hearts heavy with the loss of their youngest child. The darkness around them seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out like the claws of the entity that had taken their daughter. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened, and every step they took felt like they were being watched, hunted. The mother couldn't stop replaying the moment in her mind, her daughter's terrified eyes, the dark figure looming behind her, and the door slamming shut, cutting off her screams. It was as if the world had been ripped apart in that instant, leaving them trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The father, his face pale and hollow, led the way, but his steps were unsteady, his mind torn between disbelief and the crushing reality of their loss. But the farmhouse wasn't done with them. Even as they tried to put distance between themselves and the cursed building, they could feel its presence, a pull that dragged at their very souls. The entity was still with them, its hunger not yet fully sated. It was as if the land itself was cursed, bound to the demon, refusing to let them go. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that grew into a violent quake. The trees around them swayed ominously, their branches creaking as if in pain. The father turned to look back at the farmhouse, and his blood ran cold. The house was changing, its shape distorting, as if it were being consumed by some dark force from within. The walls cracked and crumbled, and the roof caved in, but there was no sound, no crash, only a deep, unnatural silence that filled the air. The mother screamed as she saw the ground beneath the house split open, revealing a gaping abyss. From the darkness within, a thick black smoke began to rise, swirling up into the sky like a living thing. The smoke twisted and turned, forming shapes, faces of torment, hands reaching out, clawing at the sky as if trying to escape some unseen horror. But the most terrifying thing is the figure that emerged from the smoke, towering over the ruins of the farmhouse. It was the entity, no longer bound by the walls of the house. Its form was monstrous, barely human, a mass of shadow and smoke, with eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. It stretched out its arms, and the air around the family grew colder, the temperature plummeting as the demon's presence overwhelmed them. The father grabbed the mother's hand, pulling her with him as they ran, but it felt like running through water, their movements slow and labored. The demon moved closer, the ground cracking open beneath its feet, sending shockwaves through the earth. The father stumbled, falling to his knees as the darkness overtook them. He could feel the entity's cold breath on his neck, hear the low growl that echoed in his mind, and he knew there was no escape. The mother too fell beside him, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the demon reach out, its shadowy hand stretching towards them. In that moment, the mother realized that the entity wasn't just after their lives. It wanted their souls, to drag them down into the abyss where it had come from, to torment them for eternity. She screamed, a sound filled with every ounce of fear, grief, and anger she had left. But the demon only laughed, a cold, hollow sound that resonated through the night. Just as the entity's hand was about to close around them, a brilliant light erupted from the ground. The earth beneath the family glowed with a blinding white light, and the demon recoiled, its form wavering as if in pain. The light grew brighter, driving the darkness back, and for a moment it seemed like the family might be saved. But the light was not salvation. It was something else entirely. Once the glow intensified, the family could see figures emerging from the ground, ghostly apparitions of the previous victims, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They reached out, not to save the family, but to pull them into the light, to drag them down into the depths where the demon waited. The mother and father fought, clawing at the ground, trying to resist the pull of the ghostly hands. But it was no use. The light was too strong, the apparitions too many. They were surrounded, overwhelmed by the souls of those who had been lost to the farmhouse over the centuries. The father was the first to be pulled under, his scream cut short as the ground swallowed him whole. The mother, tears streaming down her face, reached out one last time for her husband, but the light claimed her too, dragging her into the abyss. The darkness closed in around them, the demon's laughter echoing in their ears as they were pulled down into the endless void. The farmhouse, now nothing more than a smoldering ruin, stood silent once more. The land around it scarred and twisted, a testament to the evil that had been unleashed. And in the quiet that followed, the only sound that remained was the faint whisper of the wind, carrying with it the echo of the family's final screams, lost forever in the darkness, their souls claimed by the entity that would continue to haunt the farmhouse, waiting for its next victims. The horror was complete, the nightmare eternal. The farmhouse, now a charred and desolate ruin, stood as a grim monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The once vibrant land around it had withered, the trees twisted and barren, the earth scorched and lifeless. The silence that enveloped the area was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air was laden with the weight of the evil that had been unleashed. Days turned into weeks, and rumors began to spread through the nearby town. People whispered about the strange happenings at the old farmhouse, about the family that had moved in and never been seen again. Some claimed to have seen lights flickering in the windows at night or heard faint cries carried on the wind. Others spoke of seeing shadows moving among the ruins, shadows that seemed to watch and wait, but no one dared to go near the place. The townspeople knew better than to tempt the evil that lingered there. They spoke of the farmhouse in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might awaken the darkness once more. It became a place of legend, a story told to children to keep them away from the woods at night, a story of a house that was cursed, a place where the walls themselves had turned against those who lived within. Yet despite the fear it inspired, the farmhouse remained. Its blackened frame stood against the sky, a warning to all who passed by. But it was more than just a relic of a dark past. It was a beacon, a lure for those who were drawn to the unknown, to the thrill of the supernatural. And so the cycle continued. Months later, a new family arrived in town. They were outsiders, unfamiliar with the local legends. They heard the stories, of course, but they were skeptical, dismissing them as nothing more than folklore. The farmhouse, they decided, was just what they were looking for: remote, quiet, a fixer-upper with potential. Ignoring the warnings of the townspeople, they purchased the land, planning to rebuild, to start fresh. But as they stood before the ruins, gazing at the charred remains of the house, they felt a chill run down their spines, as if the land itself was watching them. The father shrugged it off, telling his family that it was just the wind, just the eerie atmosphere of an old house. But the mother hesitated, her eyes drawn to the blackened windows, where she thought she saw a shadow pass by. She shook her head, convincing herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. And so, they began the work of rebuilding, unaware of the evil that still lingered, waiting, watching. As night fell on their first day at the property, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The new family gathered inside the small trailer they had brought with them, settling in for the night. But as they slept, the ground beneath the farmhouse began to shift, a low rumble echoing through the night. From the depths of the earth, a dark presence stirred, awakened by the arrival of fresh souls. The nightmare was far from over. The farmhouse, cursed and hungry, would rise again, claiming those who dared to disturb its rest. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the shadow of the demon loomed once more, its eyes burning with the promise of the horror that was yet to come.